Today we're going to be talking about chapter 33, section 2, talking about conservative policies under Reagan and Bush. So yesterday we talked about what conservative values are, what that means in terms of economics, in terms of social issues, but now let's put those into practice. Now that Reagan is president in 1980.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the Information Purification Directives. We have created, for the first time in all history, a garden of pure ideology, where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests, obeying contradictory reports. Our unification of laws is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people, with one will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
Okay, so let's talk about Reagan's economic policies. And I finally get to explain what Reaganomics or trickle-down theory means. So at the beginning of the chapter, I shared a quote with you from Martin Feldstein. And he argued that by decreasing government spending, by putting that money back into the hands of what conservative economists call job creators or wealthy corporations or wealthy individuals in general, putting that money back in their hands is going to cause them to invest that money in order to make money, right? That's what you do when you invest money. You don't do it to help out your common person. You invest money because you want to make money. But the theory is that if you invest that money wisely, it will go into businesses that grow. Ergo, those businesses will create jobs. So, meaning he wanted to encourage private investment. Because what is Bill Gates going to do if he gets an extra $1 billion? Well, he already has a yacht. He already probably has an island. I'm sure he has the fanciest computer around. I mean, he doesn't need to buy anything else, right? It's not doing him any good to put it in a piggy bank. Think like a bank. It doesn't do him any good to just have it there and look at. What is he going to do with that money? He will take it and he will invest it wisely. Why do we believe that he will do it wisely? Because he's an ultra billionaire. He's already proven that he can invest that money wisely. Okay, so we give him more money. Okay, Bill Gates, what are you going to do with that money? Well, I believe there's an emerging industry in the Research Triangle in North Carolina that I'm going to pour that money into. It's going to be very successful, and I believe there's people in Western Carolina that can profit from that because they're going to specialize in that field, and boom, they're going to have jobs. It's going to grow the economy. Guess what? Bill Gates stands to make a ton of money off that investment. But so do you, in theory. So that's what Reaganomics means. How do we do that? Well, how do we get Bill Gates more money? Well, number one, we have to cut the budget of the federal government. Because in a progressive income tax structure, who pays the lion's share of the taxes? The wealthy. So if we lower their taxes, in theory, they're going to invest that money. Now, where are they going to invest that money? Again, in the private sector, into places that are profitable. But then here's the confusing part of conservative economics. And really, that has its drawbacks as well. Reaganomics, historically, has not often paid off, depending on your point of view. But he also believed that we should increase defense spending because, well, of the Cold War. But also because he believed that by increasing defense spending, that we were creating jobs. That folks who don't have other opportunities can go into the military and get good jobs. And again, in theory, that sounds great, more money for our soldiers. But in practice, you also have to think about where does much of this money go in terms of defense contractors and people building, elaborate new technologies and keeping a lion's share of the profit. So the theory that it will trickle down, again, the critique is that follow the money and see if it works. Okay, so if we're going to lower taxes by 25% or more in some cases, then we're going to have to cut programs because, well, we're just not making as much money. For me, like, summer job meant getting to travel in the summers. And so I realized, okay, I can find other ways to travel, or I don't need to travel as much. And so I'm going to make less money, but I'm going to do less. One of the budget cuts that Reagan prioritized was programs that he felt benefited groups that didn't earn it. His words, not mine. He called these entitlement programs. Programs that primarily benefited the poor or urban populations. Because again, the critique from conservatives in 1980 is that these programs were not earned by these people.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Ronald Reagan was not everyone's hero, but he certainly dominated the headlines that shaped the year. He promised a tougher line abroad, but at home, his chief target was the economy. He lowered taxes and slashed government spending. That was his recipe for boosting production and cutting inflation. They called it Reaganomics.
Control of the budget.
The president needed all the friends he could get. His tough line was creating victims. America's air traffic controllers went on strike in August for better pay and conditions. It created havoc for a while, but the president had an answer. He replaced them with military controllers. Union leaders were led away in shackles, and the Union itself dismantled. It was the kind of crushing victory even the president's supporters had not expected. What hurt more people were the massive cuts in welfare programs. In September, thousands of American workers gathered in Washington to tell the president it was no way to balance the budget. Economists also attacked the Reagan strategy. They said high interest rates were stifling investments and creating unemployment.
And so these tax cuts were part of what's called supply-side economics. The theory is that if you lower taxes, you put more money back into the hands of the people who are earning that money. And what are they going to do? Well, the wealthy will invest that money into businesses. The middle class will save some of that money, spending the rest. The poor will spend all of that money. In theory, all of that money that the government is not taking in will go back into the economy and will actually translate to, in the future, more revenue from taxes. So the theory, supply-side economics, is that lowering the tax rate will actually generate so much productivity that it will, over time, increase tax revenue. Supply-side economics. And so, when Reagan announced this plan and when Congress went along with it, because again, he picked up 44 states, that also means Congress is overwhelmingly on his team. And so, Congress decreased taxes by 25% over 3 years. The catch was defense spending. Over Reagan's presidency, the Defense Department's budget almost doubled. At the very same time, when there were cuts in welfare, when there were cuts in social programs that benefited the poor. In fact, Reagan and his department had this idea. Now bear with me, this idea sounds crazy. Called the Strategic Defense Initiative. It sounds like something in a video game. In fact, I think Command & Conquer stole this idea later. It's called SDI, also known as the Star Wars program. He said, hey guys, now bear with me. Let's put lasers in outer space on satellites. And you know what's going to happen? If those Russians send up ICBMs, we'll zap them. And everybody's like, are you kidding? He was absolutely not kidding. And this program is going to cost trillions of dollars. And it never actually came true. Because no, you can't put lasers in space that can blow up missiles. Sorry, guys. The technology might be there today, I don't know. It certainly wasn't there in 1980.
Then in March of 1983, Reagan decides to raise the stakes with a new initiative that the Soviets could never have imagined. It is called SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, or as its detractors would call it, the Star Wars program.
What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies?
Overstating it a bit, it was like it was on the grocery shelf and all we had to do was have the will and the money and it was here. And of course, 24 years later, we still don't have it, and we will one of these days, but he was way off in his time frame. He was very naive on that, but he was dedicated to SDI.
Many of the Russians said the only reason that Reagan could be developing SDI is because he intends a first-strike nuclear attack against the Soviet Union, and he doesn't want retaliation. That was about as dangerous as could be.
Adding to the Soviet fears of a first strike, Reagan also authorizes the deployment of American Pershing II nuclear missiles in West Germany.
Does he really mean it? Tough rhetoric, huge buildup, seemingly moving toward nuclear confrontation. People in this country were very concerned about it. People in Europe were concerned about it. And if the Soviets, if I perceive them correctly, they were very concerned about it.
So, if you haven't guessed already, his policies, well, 1981 to 1982 were the worst recession that we had experienced since the Great Depression. And really, even the recent recession that we went through in 07, 08 was compared often to what happened in 81, 82. And so partly it was due to lowering the federal budget, cutting taxes while doubling defense spending. I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that you can't spend more money than you make forever and ever and ever. As things began to get better, though, through 1983, consumer spending did begin to grow. The economy did begin to bounce back. And then it crashed again in 1987. Throughout the 1980s, as I showed you on the chart at the beginning, spending outstripped revenue. And you saw on the chart what that means. The deficit began to grow. The debt began to climb. In fact, by 1984, by the end of Reagan's first term, the national debt had doubled. So it is the privilege of the President of the United States to appoint Supreme Court justices. Reagan appointed Sandra Day O'Connor to be the first female justice. In fact, between her and other court appointments, the Supreme Court became much more conservative during Reagan's term. And while Roe v. Wade was not overturned, the court placed severe restrictions on abortion, limiting the time frame with which an abortion can be conducted. Also restrictions on civil rights, like the Back decision, eliminating many of the racial quotas of affirmative action.
One of my proudest days in office came when I appointed Sandra Day O'Connor to be the first woman in history on the United States Supreme Court.
Reagan was obviously proud to appoint Sandra Day O'Connor as the first female member of the Supreme Court. Now, Reagan promised in his inauguration that he would reduce the size of the federal government. Part of this was through lowering taxes. Part of this was by deregulation. Remember, the guy who wrote the book on capitalism, Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, I have a copy if you want to borrow it, believed that capitalism is a self-regulating system. He called it the invisible hand. If a business is bad, people won't shop there. That business will be replaced by a better business. If a business treats its people bad, people won't work there, and that business will be replaced by a better business. That competition would drive innovation. And so that was Reagan's theory that he worked off of when he said the government is getting in the way of all this with all these silly rules. For example, he cut the budget of the EPA. He said the EPA, remember the Environmental Protection Agency, according to conservatives, was getting in the way of economic progress. Guess whose budget got cut when Trump went into office? The EPA. Because again, conservatives claim that environmental protections often get in the way of economic progress. The Department of the Interior gave more contracts than ever for oil drilling, for harvesting of lumber and coal. Millions of public lands were sold off to private developers for that very reason. Reagan won a sweeping re-election. During his first term in office, he had plenty of fans. There were plenty of folks who just looked at the bottom line and said, my taxes are lower because of you. Boom, that's it. I make more money because of you. So business people often supported Reagan. Southerners often supported Reagan. The message about civil rights was well received. And so people saw the Republican Party as the party that most closely resembled their anti-civil rights values. People in the West just wanted to be left alone, and reducing the size of the federal government helps accomplish that. So again, Westerners often supported him. And then finally, the Reagan Democrats. Evangelicals are often very passionate and concerned about social issues. But at the same time, the abortion issue has become a polarizing factor. So it doesn't matter if you care about the poor or if you care about immigration or health care, because if you see abortion as this polarizing factor, then you can't vote for a Democrat, according to that point of view. And so people started calling those who supported Reagan because of his anti-abortion policies, they started calling them Reagan Democrats. Okay, so Reagan won re-election by a landslide. So in '88, most Americans were, the economy was on rather sound footing. Reagan endorsed his vice president to run for office, and George H.W. Bush ran, promising simply no new taxes. Picked up a large portion of the popular vote, picked up about as many states as Reagan did. And so, many people saw this as a conservative mandate, as a vote to continue the policies that had made the 1980s.